Hello! It is time for another reading from Church History and Plain Language by Bruce Shelley. I highly recommend this book to anyone who doesn't have it. Now we'll be reading from chapter 30, Opening the Rock, Uttermost America and Asia. Okay. On Thursday, October 11th, 1492, otherwise known as the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, a new world opened for the Christian faith. On that day, Christopher Columbus, admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy and governor of whatever territory he might discover, sighted sandpipers, green reeds, and finally land in what we call the West Indies. The next morning, Columbus stepped on the island shore, named it San Salvador, which means Holy Savior, and took possession of it in the name of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. He offered to the curious natives red caps and glass beads to put around their necks. This gave them such obvious pleasure that Columbus surmised that they could be easily, quote-unquote, converted to our holy faith by love rather than by force. Historians speak of the next 150 years as the Age of Discovery because during these decades, Europeans planted colonies in the Americas and found new trade routes to the riches of the Far East. In the history of Christianity, we might call these years the Age of Global Expansion, since between 1500 and 1650, Roman Catholic monks and friars carried the gospel to Spanish colonies throughout Latin America and Portuguese ports along the coast of Africa and Asia. Through all these exhilarating years, Columbus's original alternative troubled Christian missionaries. Should the natives be won by the holy faith, to the holy faith by love or by force? The problem with these people is that they think that you could win people by force. That is their entire problem. And it was like a problem that seemed to have lasted for so long. Okay, at the time, it was some courageous and selfless Franciscan or Jesuit winning through, at times it was some courageous and selfless Franciscan or Jesuit winning through persevering love. At others, it was some troop of ruthless Christian conquerors forcing baptism on natives at the point of the sword. The problem arose because missionaries must always decide what heathenism is. Is it humanity stumbling in uncertain quest of the truth of the true God? Or is it humanity organized in hardening resistance to the gospel? Should the Christian ambassador seek the good in the heathen religions and use it as a foundation for building a Christian community? Or should he suppress, destroy if necessary, all forms of heathen religion in order to plant the true faith? We can call one approach the policy of adaptation and the other the policy of conquest. Next section, the gospel and culture. Adaptation or conquest rests in turn upon a broader question. How does the gospel relate to culture? The church is often in danger of identifying the gospel with some cultural form in which the faith has found a home. And thus missionaries, assuming their culture was essential to the gospel, failed to adapt to the new ways of another people. They felt constrained to insist on only one expression of faith, theirs. In the age of the apostles, Jewish Christians initially believed devoutly that the Christian faith was identical with Hebrew rites and covenants and Sabbaths. Only when the good news broke free from its Jewish cultural forms was it able to take root in the Greco-Roman world. The same was true when the invading Germanic tribes destroyed many of the institutions of Roman life. The Christian faith had to find new ways to speak effectively to medieval people. The early and high Middle Ages were times of dedicated missionary efforts. During the Middle Ages, however, an important attitude developed among European Christians. The rise of Islam in the 17th century drove a wedge between Christians in Europe and their fellow believers in Asia and Africa. Only a few outposts of Christianity survived in the Islamic countries of North Africa and the Near East. Christianity was confined almost exclusively to Europe. The Crusades were the convulsive attempt of Christian Europe to batter down the barriers of Islam by military force. The long struggle in Spain and Portugal to drive out the Moors, as the Muslims were called there, created an especially militant attitude toward the unbelieving outsider. Because of the wars, conquest, and and evangelization intertwined, few minds could recognize a difference. The new age of worldwide missions opened with the era of great discoveries. The Portuguese and Spaniards first turned their ships south in the middle of the 15th century. The French, Dutch, and English soon joined the colonizing venture. Following the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese reached the southern tip of the continent in 1486 and named it the Cape of Good Hope. In 1595, Vasco da Gama continued around Africa in the direction of Asia and first sighted land on the western or Malabar coast of India. It was a spot ideally suited to serve as a base of operation for Portuguese expansion in the Far East. For centuries, the Malabar ports, Arab merchants had picked up spices. For centuries in the Malabar ports, Arab merchants had picked up spices, gems, ivory, Indian cotton, and Chinese silk and had shipped them through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, then overland to the Mediterranean world. The Portuguese realized that these ports were centers of exchange between the East and the West, the heart of the Eastern trade. In short order, the Portuguese drove the flimsy Arab vessels from the Indian Ocean. They made Goa on the Malabar coast the center of their eastern commercial empire and moved on eastward to plant strategic bases in the Malay. Imagine if, this is definitely distraction. I'm going to say it anyway, though, to anyone who's watching this. Imagine if we, got people on the moon and we got them there such that they could survive. So, they're able to plant things on the moon. They're doing all this stuff. And, they're, starting their whole little mini civilization. And then, for some reason, 200 years goes by where nobody can get to them. They can't get back here. We can't get there. But they can survive. And then, 200 years later, we go to the moon. And we see what civilization has become like there. That would be very interesting. Really cool. Anyways, all right, back to this. The Portuguese realized that these ports were centers of exchange between the East and the West, the heart of the Eastern trade. In short order, the Portuguese drove the flimsy Arab vessels from the Indian Ocean. They made Goa on the Malabar coast the center of their Eastern commercial empire and moved on eastward to plant strategic bases in the Malay archipelago. I don't know how to say that. Okay, it's Malay, and then the next word is Archipelago. So there's that place. It says here, they made Goa on the Malabar coast the center of their eastern commercial empire and moved on eastward to plant strategic bases in the Malay archipelago and the Moluccan Islands. Aleutian Islands. I think that's actually how you say it. Aleutian Islands. By 1516, they had reached China, and by 1543, Japan. The Portuguese, unlike the Spanish, made no attempt to conquer or colonize on a large scale. They had no interest in land, no visions of mining for gold. They wanted a trade monopoly. That meant control of the seas. Sort of like the Iranians and the Hormuz. Okay, so Portuguese ports sprang up along the coast of West Africa, the Congo, and Angola. In India and Ceylon, in Brazil, Mozambique, and Malaya. It makes a big difference whether I've ever actually heard this word spoken before. I don't have any issues pronouncing Mozambique, but that's because I've heard it said a lot. Meanwhile, here I am struggling with Malaya. Malaya? Malaysia? Is that Y, like a Z sound? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. In every trading settlement, little Catholic churches appeared. Malaysia, oh my gosh, I bet you that's what it means. I'm saying it basically right. It's just a word that nobody uses, except for probably the people who live there. Malaya, yeah, that's okay, good. I'm so glad, because I was worried that was some word that I should have definitely known how to say. Okay, now, Spaniards in the New World, next section. Meanwhile, the Spaniards were following up the discoveries of Columbus. The red-headed Genoese made 3 more trips to the New World in a vain attempt to find an opening to the Asian mainland. On the second of these trips, he sailed with 17 ships bearing 1,500 men, and on Haiti he found gold, lots of it. Bet you're doggone now. Or maybe they just need to dig deeper. I don't know. After tracing the coast of Cuba, which he thought was southern China, Columbus set sail for Spain. In spite of an oath of secrecy, the magic word gold leaked into the homeland, and the most violent gold rush in history was underway. Within 15 years of the first sighting of San Salvador, the Spaniards had plundered and conquered the New World from California to the tip of South America. The work of these courageous and brutal conquerors planted the word conquistadors in our vocabularies. In 1521, Hernando Cortez, equipped with horses, armor, and gunpowder, had destroyed the great Aztec Empire in Mexico. And by 1533, Francisco Pizarro had treacherously murdered Atahualpa, the monarch of the Incas, and brought the once mighty empire to its knees. All this, it is worth noting, happened in Martin Luther's lifetime. Charles V, who succeeded Ferdinand and Isabella and fell heir to the enormous wealth of the New World, was the same prince before whom Luther stood at the Diet of Worms. I don't know why it's called the Diet of Worms, but all right. So while Charles struggled to keep Germany from slipping from his imperial grasp into Protestant hands, he found comfort in the gold-laden Spanish ships arriving from the West Indies and Mexico. Maybe if he wasn't distracted with gold, he would have done a better job keeping a hold of his control back at home. All right. I'm not saying that would have been a good thing. I don't think it would have, but, All right. This great global venture, however, was far from a breathless race for spices and gold. Deep within the hearts of the Portuguese merchants and the Spanish conquistadors was the zeal to extend the holy faith, the Roman Catholic faith of their fathers. Thus, Dominicans, you know what, I bet you these people did not believe in the end times, let's all get zapped into the sky all at once thing, because they seem like they're trying to conquer the world in a governmental kind of a way. Anyways, moving on. Okay, this great global venture, however, was far from a breathless race for spices and gold. Deep within the hearts of the Portuguese merchants and the Spanish conquistadors was the zeal to extend the holy faith, the Roman Catholic faith of their fathers. Thus, Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, or Jesuits sailed on nearly every ship, as eager to convert the heathen as any captain to find a new port for trade. The sacrifices that many of these monks and friars made were extraordinary. The voyages at sea were risky, and there were no furloughs. Out of 376 Jesuits who sailed for China between 1581 and 1712, 127 died en route. That's a lot. Thanks to such men, 16th century, which saw Europe divided between Catholic and Protestants, also saw Christianity become Catholic in a new way. Just when it was painfully apparent that Catholic no longer meant united, it was universal in its mission to distant peoples. The Catholic Church was no longer confined to Europe. To avoid rivalry between Portugal and Spain, the Pope drew a line on the map from the North Pole to the south, just west of Azores. All to the west of the line, he said, belonged to Spain. All to the east belonged to Portugal. That boundary explains why Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country today and the rest of Latin America is Spanish, and why no Spanish colonies appeared in Africa or Asia. By papal commission, the kings of Portugal and Spain were responsible to evangelize the lands conquered by their soldiers. The Roman Catholic Church expected these princes to send out missionaries and maintain them, whether in India or Peru. The monarchs had exclusive control over the missionaries and could name bishops to lead their newly baptized subjects. Thus, the underlying idea of this new missionary era was the extension of the concept of the Christian prince, the divinely appointed spiritual guide of his people, who was expected to remove all signs of idolatry from his lands and bring his subjects to the rule of Christ through the Holy Catholic Church. Here is a picture. It says, this world map depicts how the Pope divided the world between Portugal and Spain. This map was made by Franciscus Manachas and dates to 1527. Here it is. Okay, just one moment while I drink. And pour some. I suspect that maybe like some of the kind of earning your salvation stuff seeped into, like, I think it somehow influenced the belief that you could convert a person by force in some way. Although I haven't tied all the pieces in my mind together yet. Given Spain's history of passionate devotion to Mother Church, developed over centuries of conflict with the Moors and Islam's military encroachment into Spain, the attitude of conquest of the Spanish in the New World was somewhat understandable. They assumed the same militant posture, the same superstition of a crusade. Cortes, the ruthless and skillful conqueror of Mexico, for example, was devoted to the Virgin Mary and always kept a statue of her on his person. He said his prayers and attended daily mass. Upon one flag he carried was a cross, and upon the other a picture of the Virgin. Spain's first policy toward the indigenous population, called encomienda, granted the Spanish colonists a number of natives who were supposed to toil in the mines and on the plantations of their captors. So they enslaved them. For their trouble, the natives received protection and instruction in the holy faith. Since the natives were considered guilty of gross crimes such as human sacrifice, they probably actually were guilty of that. So, kind of fine with conquering the human sacrificing groups. Since the natives were considered guilty of gross crimes such as human sacrifice and idolatry, the Spanish felt duty-bound to stop these barbarities. Wars against these natives then, in the minds of the Spanish, were righteous wars like Israel's against the godless Canaanites. In 1531, Bishop Zumarraga wrote from Mexico that they had destroyed more than 500 temples and 20,000 idols. Next section is Champion of the Oppressed. I'm actually going to read this little section here, Profiles of Faith. I'm going to start it right now. This is Juan de Zumarraga, 1469 to 1548. This guy, Juan, was the first bishop and then the first archbishop of Mexico. He embodies the ambivalent and complex history of colonial Christianity in the New World. Zumarraga brought a printing press to Mexico, the first in the Western Hemisphere, to print books for the instruction of the natives. Zumarraga also introduced reforms that opened up the lowest, non-sacramental orders of the priesthood to Native Americans. He helped found the University of Mexico. Like Bartolomé de las Casas, Zumarraga, otherwise known as Juan, was known as a defender of the native population and campaigned against their exploitation by Spanish colonists, but he was also active in the persecution of heretics during the Inquisition. Appointed Apostolic Inquisitor of New Spain in 1536, he presided over the trial of 130 people, 13 of them Native Americans, the most infamous case being the chief Carlos Chichimetecatl, who was burned at the stake. Okay, back to the regular text. One champion of the oppressed Native Americans was Bartholomew de las Casas, whose father had accompanied Columbus on that second voyage in the West Indies. At first, Bartholomew was as much part of the Christian imperialism as the next Spaniard in the West Indies or Mexico. In his middle 30s, however, he had a spiritual conversion and was ordained to the priesthood. He had a spiritual conversion and was ordained to the priesthood, the first such ordination in the New World. He began to feel pangs of conscience. In a sermon before the governor and leading settlers, he denounced the cruelties he saw around him. How could the Christians God ordain brutality as an instrument of Christian conversion? Amen. Las Casas met widespread resistance. Many considered him a menace to New Spain. Some missionaries argued that wild and barbarous people could not come to faith without the force necessary to show them the error of their ways. Some colonists insisted that Las Casas' opposition to encomienda would bring the colonies to economic ruin. Las Casas, however, persisted in his views. He made 14 trips across the Atlantic to urge Spanish leaders to consider another way to win the natives to the faith. Thanks in part to his appeals, Charles V in 1542 issued a series of new laws, the Laws of the Indies, which softened the severity of the encomienda system and established the principle that natives had human rights too. How nice of them. Laws written in Spain, however, were one thing. Practice in Mexico was another. In a famous debate held at Valladolid on the Yucatan Peninsula in 1550, Las Casas argued for the equality and freedom of the Native Americans. The only way to convert them, he said, was by peaceful preaching of the word and by the example of holy living. His opponent was a theologian, Juan Gines de Sepulveda, who used Aristotle's argument that certain peoples are by nature born to slavery. The Spanish, he said, are as much above the Indians as a man is above the ape. So despite La Casa's best effort, Christian imperialism and slavery continued in the New World and hampered the spread of the gospel among the native population. Native Americans were eager enough to accept the Christian faith, but they were just as ready to abandon it. Between 1524 and 1531, the Franciscans baptized more than 1 million Mexicans. The practice of mass baptisms had the same effect as mass conversions in Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages. Conversion because of coercion and conformity and ignorance and superstition regarding Christian symbols. One well-known story has it that Cortez left the strictest instructions in one town that the citizens were to worship the Christian god and to care for one of his horses, which was lame. The natives faithfully obeyed. They fed the horse fruit and flowers until it died. They supposed that the horse and the Christian god were the same. Later, 2 Franciscans discovered that the natives had made an image of the horse and were worshiping it as the god of thunder and lightning. It's kind of sad. In the East, the Portuguese, like the Spanish, took the view that a Christian king was responsible to God for the spiritual welfare of his subjects. As a result, Goa, the center of the Portuguese commercial empire in the Orient, became a city of great Baroque churches. It had an archbishop who served as the representative of the authority of the Catholic Church throughout East Asia, and Portuguese authorities saw that no idolatry defiled the territory of their Christian king. The Portuguese faced a problem, however, that the Spanish never encountered in the Americas. They met highly developed civilizations and ancient religions far stronger than those of the Incas and the Aztecs. These had a significant impact on the way many Christian missionaries approached Asian peoples. In India, Japan, and China, the policy of conversions by conquest was modified, and in some cases abandoned in favor of the policy of adaptation. Jesuits in particular asked which Japanese, Chinese, or Indian customs were merely social or civil as contrasted with those that were actually incompatible with Christian baptism. Next section, Francis Xavier. In the pioneer of Christian missions in the Far East, landed in Goa in 1542. Francis Xavier, 1506 to 1552, the associate of Ignatius Loyola, was commissioned as a papal legate in the service of the King of Portugal. Officials everywhere were obligated to assist him in his preaching mission. He found Goa, like most seaports, filled with riffraff from 1,000 shores, catering to lustful appetites. Xavier stayed in Goa only a few months, but in that short time he sparked something of a moral revolution in the port. Then, eager to break new ground, he turned his eyes to a more demanding field, the southern tip of India. In 1534, some fisher folk living on the southeast coast had sought the protection of the King of Portugal. Robbers on land and sea had been making their lives miserable. The Portuguese agreed to protect them if they would accept Christian baptism. They did, but for the first 8 years of their Christian profession, they had no one to explain to them what this new faith involved. Xavier, the little dark man, stepped into that need. He went everywhere over the sand hills where the fishing villages were scattered. He would ring a bell to call the villagers together to recite the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Rosary. When the villagers had learned the words and professed their belief in the Creed, Xavier would baptize them by the hundreds until his hands dropped from exhaustion. After 3 years, he had an organized church to pass on to his successors. The Paravars, as these fisher folk were called, numbered perhaps 30,000. That's a lot. Since Christianity among them was restricted to one caste, They had little contact with their neighbors outside of trade. The church survived, therefore, only as an island in a sea of Hinduism. The Jesuits followed Xavier, supported by the Portuguese authorities, gathered the Paravars into villages and slowly fashioned their lives according to Christian standards. No boat set out to fish on Sunday. A part of each Friday's catch went to the church. Gradually, all memory of a time when the Paravars were not Christian died away. The center of their life was the church, the one stone building around which their huts of palm leaf and thatch were clustered. Roman Catholics and Protestants unite in praising Francis Xavier's missionary zeal and personal charm. He was a man of his time, however. His years in India show that he at first shared the religious intolerance of his age. In a letter written on May 16, 1546, he told the King of Portugal that to have good Christians in India, the king should establish the Inquisition to suppress Muslims. The king granted his request, and the Inquisition continued in Goa until the 19th century. Xavier, however, had no intention of remaining in Goa or its region. His commission from Pope and King extended to the whole of the Far East. So in 1546, he moved on from India to Malaya. After nearly 2 years of ministry there, he was ready to find new worlds to conquer. He returned to Goa, and in 1549, with letters from the authorities, he sailed for Japan, the Isles of Marco Polo's dreams. With 2 companies, Xavier landed on Japan in August 15th. It proved to be an opportune time. Governed only by feudal barons and eager for trade with the outside world, Japan welcomed the strangers. Buddhism was out of favor, and no national religion presented opposition to the gospel. The years in Japan changed Xavier's view of Christian missions. During his earlier days in India, he had held the imperialist position. Heathenism had nothing in common with the true faith. Everything had to be leveled to the ground before anything Christian could be erected, the view of most missionaries in Latin America. In Japan, however, Xavier confronted a people with so many marks of nobility. He shifted his ground. He saw that while the gospel must transform and refine the Japanese, it need not discard as worthless everything in Japanese life and culture. Surrounded by the impressive ancient religions of the East, many Jesuits who followed Xavier developed a quality totally uncharacteristic of the Counter-Reformation: compromise in cultural expressions of religious matters. The Society of Jesus dominated the Christian mission in Japan until the end of the 16th century. Their work met with remarkable success. In 1577, one Jesuit wrote optimistically, "In 10 years, all Japan will be Christian if we have enough missionaries." 2 years later, the Jesuits did establish a new town as a home for Christian converts. They called it Nagasaki, which happened to have been bombed, thoroughly bombed in World War II. That's weird. Before the end of the century, missionaries could count 300,000 converts, hundreds of churches, and 2 Christian colleges. Through the years, the Jesuits followed Xavier's lead and looked for ways to express the Christian faith in the culture of their hosts. They adopted the local customs and values in every way they could, and they moved as rapidly as possible to train Japanese leaders for the churches. Unfortunately, early in the 17th century, new rulers, fearful that foreign missionaries meant foreign invaders, launched a policy of persecution against Christians. Between 1614 and 1642, no fewer than 4,045 martyrs made the ultimate witness for Christ, some by sword, some by the stake, some by the boiling cauldron. The once thriving Christian work in Japan disintegrated. Only a remnant survived in the hills near Nagasaki. Next section. The door to China. In China, the story of Christian missions during this era parallels the saga in Japan. Once again, the visionary was Francis Xavier. After 2 years preaching in the streets of Japan, the intrepid Xavier decided it was time to enter China. He returned to Goa to secure the necessary authority. But on the passage east, he found it difficult to get beyond Singapore. Hoping to smuggle himself into Canton, He took a ship as far as an island off the coast of southern China. There he fell ill and died, bringing to an end one of the most imaginative careers in missionary history. The year was 1552. The doorway to China that Xavier failed to find opened to his spiritual successors. In 1567, a small island off the coast of China, Macau, became a Portuguese colony. For years, however, entrance to China seemed impossible. The ruling Ming dynasty had no interest in contacts with the outside world. They considered the Chinese as the givers of culture, not the receivers. Confucianism was dominant in the empire, and the state, the family, and ethics were governed by its ideals and teachings. According to one story, Alessandro Vilignani, the leader of the Jesuits in the Orient, looking out his window at Macau in 1579, cried out toward the Chinese coast, "Oh, rock, rock, when will you open?" Valignani recalled a 30-year-old Italian Jesuit teaching at the time in a seminary in Goa, Matthew Ricci, 1552 to 1610. Ricci had studied mathematics, astronomy, and cosmology in Rome before landing in India. He seemed unusually prepared for work among the Chinese, so Valignani called Ricci to Macau and placed the burden of China on his shoulders. Ricci's first task was to settle in Macau to learn the Chinese language and customs, and to wait for the rock to crack. In 1583, he secured permission to settle in Shaoxing, the provincial capital. With their traditional respect for the scholar, the Chinese responded to a man who, dressed in the garb of a Mandarin, spoke their language and was able to open to them new fields of learning. Ricci made a map of the world for them and introduced them to the new science of the calendar. Such contacts proved useful for gaining toleration from the Chinese, but Ricci was convinced that China could never be won to the Christian faith from an outlying province. Step by step, he moved toward the capital of the empire. In 1600, he gained permission to enter Beijing itself. Ricci used 2 clocks to gain imperial favor. He brought the clocks with him as gifts to the emperor. They pleased the monarch very much, but when they ran down, the Chinese experts had no idea how to restart them. Ricci's skill in keeping them in working order gained the emperor's warm approval and allowed Ricci to remain in the capital for 10 years as an astronomer and mathematician. Under Ricci's wise guidance, the Jesuit mission in Beijing took root and flourished. A number of notable families and scholars were baptized. At the time of Ricci's death in 1610, the church numbered 2,000. Ricci's successor, Adam Schall, carried the scholarly work to an even higher level. He won the admiration of the Chinese scholar class, but by accurately predicting the time of an eclipse of the moon, and became the director of the Imperial Astronomical Service. In 1650, Schall built a public church in Beijing and gained religious freedom for Christianity in the whole of the empire. That was in 1657. At Schall's death, there were almost 270,000 Christians in China. The Imperial Edict of Toleration in 1692 rewarded the service of the Jesuits on behalf of China and the Imperial House, and thus an independent Chinese church approached reality. The Chinese mission, however, met with misfortune, this time not from external pressures, but from the Dominican and Franciscan missionaries who argued that adaptation to Chinese ways had gone too far. Ricci had tried to avoid presenting Christianity to the Chinese as something new. He refused to consider these advanced and religious people as atheists, so he taught that traditional Chinese devotion reached perfection in the Christian faith. The Lord of Heaven, whom the Chinese had so long revered, was God. Ricci contended that the reverence for ancestors so common in China was not a religious act, but a social one, and therefore acceptable to Christians. Had adaptation gone too far? In 1631, a Franciscan and Dominican arrived in Beijing and were shocked at what they found. The word used to translate the Christian Mass in the Jesuit Catechism was the Chinese character for the ceremony of ancestor worship. One night, the friars went in disguise to such a ceremony. They watched as Chinese Christians participated and were scandalized by what they saw. They reported their experience to Rome, and the quarrel over the rites began. One pope approved, another disapproved, until after a century the whole mission in China fell into serious decline. The conflict between the policy of adaptation and the policy of conquest did not end with the 17th century. It continues today. Only conquest is usually in terms of economic control rather than political. But the age of global expansion was special in one sense. It opened up huge areas of the Earth's surface to the Christian message. It displayed some of the most innovative and creative missionary leaders found in any age. The end.